Do you ever wonder what makes a good kick drum? Well, fear not, today I'm answering that question. So today we're in this project over here. I've shown this project of many times before. There's a whole bunch of different interesting things about this project. Of course, I'm not going to play the whole thing. That would be a little bit of a waste of time, but I'm just going to play you the kick and bass so that you can have an idea of what it sounds like. And then the kick on its own just sounds like this. So you can hear that we're going for something fairly specific in here, in that it's a very clean sounding kick. There's not a lot of distortion, there's not a lot of rumble like you would hear, for example, in techno. And one of the other characteristics that you can hear is that it doesn't really have a knocking effect. You can hear there's a very distinct click, there's a very distinct sub, but in between there's not that very strong mid-range component that you'll often hear in other genres. So I'm just quickly going to go into the patch so that I can actually explain what's going on, but we'll actually move to a different project where I'm going to explain the main components that you would need to look out for and all of the things that could potentially ruin your kick drum. So just going into it, you can see that I'm using an instrument rack over here, and we have two chains in there. One is the kick drum chain, which is just the kick drum plugin. This is going to be the main body of the kick. And then we have this sampler over here that is just loading a hat, which is layering a hat on top of my kick drum. And while the hat is interesting, it is not the main component, so I'm not really going to focus on it. The only thing that I'll say is when I'm loading a hat, usually what I end up doing is I'm turning the sustain down all the way, and then we have the decay, which allows me to determine the length of the hat so that it doesn't become too long and intrusive. So the main kick drum plugin opens up like this for me, and as you can see, I've made it full screen so that it's easy for me to work in. So one of the things that you'll immediately notice about the shape of the kick drum is that we have the click over here. So this is the start of the kick drum, of course, and then it goes down a lot and then it goes back up again for the sub. In terms of the length, I set a very specific length of 1/8 notes. So this is going to be half of the beat. And then for the second half of the beat, the low end is going to be provided by the bass, which means that one of the important things that you want to do with your kick drum is leave enough space for the sub bass of the bass line. You don't want this sub bass over here to actually bleed into your bass line. Now, this is going to depend on the type of psytrance that you're making. Generally speaking, when it comes to psytrance, this rule holds, but if you're making something like high-tech, you may want to go for a 16 note, so that you have 3 notes that the bass can play, as opposed to 2 notes that the bass can play the sub bass in. Or you can go somewhere in between, in which case you have to do a little bit of magic in terms of like phase alignment and just proper mixing between the kick and bass and all of that stuff. But all of that and much more is explained in my ultimate guide to kick and bass for Psytrance. Now, if you're really interested in this particular kick drum and you want to get this particular sound, you can just, of course, copy over the settings that you see on screen here. I can also switch it to the volume envelope so that you can see the volume as well as the EQ. But I mainly want to focus on the general ideas, and I don't really want to dive into like individual kick drums like this, because at the end of the day, a majority of the sound of the kick drum is going to be personal taste. There are just a few things that you can actually do wrong about your kick and that can actually ruin your kick in a significant way. Now, to combat a lot of these things, one of the things that I highly recommend that you do is to have a monitoring plugin. So for example, I have Psyscope over here, which I can just open up and then I can play the kick and bass. Or in this case, just the kick. And as you can see, now we can actually have a look at the waveform of the kick drum. I have to align this over here. Something like that, so that the transient is neatly aligned over there. And then we can see that whatever I said before about the kick drum not bleeding into the second part is still true, in that here, of course, it is completely silent. The kick drum is basically just taking up the first half of the beat and it's providing maximum power there. And then for the second half of the beat, you can see it just completely silent. So this is where the sub bass of the bass line would sit. Now, another thing that you'll again will notice is that we again have that shape of the click over here, and it moves down and moves back up again for the sub. This is usually achieved either through the volume envelope, which we can go back and look at over here. You can see the volume, we have the click, it goes down and then it goes back up again. But it's also influenced by the EQ that you apply, because at the end of the day, what is happening with an EQ is that you're just EQing individual frequencies, and this is just a pitch sweep. So this goes through the frequencies over time. What that means is that at the beginning of the kick drum, if I zoom in like this, you can see that this is the highest frequency oscillation that we have in the kick drum. And it just slows down and goes through the whole frequency spectrum until it gets to the lowest frequency, which in this case is 40 Hertz. Which means that by EQing it in a way, in a certain way, what will happen is that you're effectively just changing the amplitude of the waveform in particular parts of the kick drum. In this particular plugin, the EQ isn't actually like applied to the signal, it is just calculated into the volume envelope itself. So it just readjusts the volume envelope to reflect what would happen if an EQ like this would be applied. The difference between that and just applying a normal EQ is that, of course, there's no phase shift coming from this EQ, which again, you can see if I do something like this. Notice how the sine waves are moving back and forth, which is the telltale sign of phase shift. It is just upping and lowering the volume of the sine wave. Now, another thing that you'll see with my kick drums in particular is that I have the phase set in a particular way, in the sense that at the halfway point, what I want enough space for the bassline transient, meaning that I want to be very close to a zero crossing over here. Maybe that shows up a little bit better in Psyscope, so let's go back into that. You can see if I zoom in to that halfway point of the kick drum, we are fairly close to zero crossing over here. Of course, it doesn't have to be perfect, and I just align this based on the view that we get over here if I include the bassline. What I'm essentially looking for when I'm mixing the kick and bass together is that this area over here doesn't get a massive volume increase just when the bass is playing. And you can see here is where the transient of the bass note is sitting. And with or without playing the bass line, you can still see that the main oscillation over here, the main sub bass is actually coming from the kick drum. This is just this sub bass continuing into the part where also the bass line is playing. So now in an empty project, what I want to do is essentially just make a kick drum from scratch and tell you all of the things that I would worry about when it comes to kick drum design. So I'm just opening the kick drum plugin, but you can follow along with any other kick drum generating plugin. Let's do something like this so that it's easy to see. And what I'm immediately going to do is delete all of these points over here so that we're just working with 3 points. And one of the things that you'll often hear in Psytrance kicks, especially for beginners, is what they do is they'll make something like this, where you get like a sweep down. Notice that it doesn't really sound like a click, it almost sounds like a zap sound, especially if you do something like this. It goes down like zoop, zoop, as opposed to like an actual click, which in my opinion is indicative of a kick drum that is just poorly designed. So what I would immediately like to do is have a point right here that is very close so that we can actually get a click, which means that essentially what this is doing is that we're immediately going into much lower frequencies, so into the mid-range here. And now you can hear that we get like an actual proper click, and then it goes into the sub part. Of course, we want to set our length properly. Right now we're making a high-tech kick, which is 1/16 note. So we'll just set this to 1/8. Of course, that changes the layout of our kick, and we may need to compensate for that by moving this a little bit closer. Something like that. We just want a very clear, like snappy click to it. And then what I want to do is I want to lower this starting frequency, maybe to like 10K, something like that. Maybe a bit higher. Sometimes you need to turn off this to get exact tuning. Something like that is good. The reason for this is I don't actually want our kick drum to start messing with the area where my top drums are going to be. So by leaving everything above around 10K blank, what we're essentially going to get is a space for our top drums to sit in and not be disturbed by the kick. I do the same with my bassline. I usually low pass my basslines at around 8K, something like that. Again, of course, it's going to depend on the bassline, but that is like a general rule of thumb. Around that area, I want it to be low pass so that when the top drums come in, they don't actually clash with this very sharp part of the transient of the bassline. And the same is true for the kick drum. Also, if you're layering hats on top of that, this means that you're going to have an excellent space where you can layer your hat in. So now we need to work on the punch of the kick, and the way that I'm going to do that is by adding another point over here. And we can basically just divide this up into 2 points here. We can start messing with this over here. This is where you start to think about the tonality. Of course, there's things that you can do wrong over here as well. If you do something like this is going to sound awful. But you can play around roughly with what you want, something like this. If you want it to be a little bit higher, that's good. If you want it to be like very punchy, that is also okay. If you want it to be fairly dark, you get like a very dark, almost a muffled kind of sound, but still having a transient to it. But somewhere in the middle is probably going to be nice. And finally, for the final part of the body, what we essentially just have to decide is the landing frequency where we're going to land on. Usually what I like is to raise this a little bit, maybe to like 40 Hertz or something like that. That is usually an area where the sub is very pronounced. You don't want to go any lower than maybe 35 Hertz because a lot of systems cannot actually reproduce that. And you don't want to go too high. Oftentimes what I hear is somebody that has a kick that kind of sounds like this. Maybe that is very exaggerated. Maybe like 60 Hertz or something like that. That is going to sound off because it doesn't really have the depth, it doesn't really have the power that you actually want from your sub bass. So this is just too high. Now there's a lot of people that debate over kick drum tuning, and this would be tuned to say A sharp over here. If I want to do that exactly, of course, we get something like this. This particular kick would be tuned to A sharp exactly, but that is not what we want. We want to have the kick drum actually have a lot of weight to it, have a lot of power to it. So for me, that just takes precedent over the actual tuning of the kick drum. So again, we'll put this down into a spot where we get a nice oomph out of it, maybe like E1 here. And now we have a proper kick drum. Now, one of the reasons why we do have a proper kick drum is because this plugin opens up with a volume envelope that is essentially perfect for the Psytrance kick. Maybe you want a little bit more transients, then you can up this a little bit more. And what you'll also see is that the EQ actually opens up with this very strong cut over here. This is the kind of cut that acts right after the transient. So this is giving more space to the transient and is kind of separating the transient and the sub a little bit. This is often what you'll hear inside of Psytrance, but sometimes you don't want that. So let's make a very exaggerated example of something like this. This may be, of course, a bit too much. But you can hear that kind of knocking mid-range, that kind of knocking punch. This is not often desired, but sometimes this is maybe something that you want to go for. Personally, I don't like it, so I would go for something like this. Maybe have this come up a little bit earlier and EQ this out a bit more. It just sounds like it has a little bit more weight to it this way, which is an effect that I really like. And then, of course, once we're in the context of an actual track, what I would do is I would add maybe a little bit more EQ. This is never going to be my final EQ because I mix in a different project, of course. But maybe I think like, okay, the transient needs a little bit more. I might want to cut off a little bit more of the high end over here. Maybe do something like this. And at this point, it is just about fine tuning and trying to get like the tonality that you're after, making sure that it works well with the bass line, making sure that it works well with the rest of the musical idea. Of course, those things are very, very important when you're designing your kick drum. And one of the reasons why I really like this plugin is because nothing that you're doing in this plugin is destructive. So as long as you keep your kick drum in this plugin, you can essentially edit it however you want it. Like you're never rendering anything, you're never committing to anything, and you can just make the edits that you want to make. And it will just be a very flexible workflow as it just allows you to shape the kick drum exactly how you want it to. But of course, I do my final mixing inside of a Reaper project, so I might EQ it a little bit more. I might add a few other effects to it. When it comes to effects though, and loading plugins onto it, I would recommend that you are careful with that, especially stuff like high-pass filters. What I see often happening is that somebody adds a high-pass filter on their kick drum, or even on their kick and bass group or their master chain or something like that. Maybe even add like a lower frequency that doesn't really influence the actual amplitude of individual harmonics of the actual kick drum. But what you'll see will happen here, if I open up SciScope again, you'll find that it actually makes the kick drum longer. Notice how the kick drum is much longer than it actually needs to be. And turning it off, we actually get the kick drum that we exactly want in terms of the length, in terms of the size as well, right? Again, as we said before, we're not bleeding into any of the parts where the sub bass of the bass line is going to play. So with high pass filters like this, if there is no actual content down below at that frequency level, just don't bother with this kind of stuff. It doesn't do anything for you and it can be very, very destructive. And of course, because we're generating the kick drum, we can be sure that there's no content there because we set it to a certain pitch. We set it to a certain pitch over here, so there's not going to be any content below that pitch, below the particular frequency that we set over here. So that's usually what I look for when I'm creating my kick drums. I hope that this helps you create better kick drums yourself as well. When it comes to this plugin, I've of course done more videos on it. So if you need a little bit of a refresher on how this plugin actually works, there's 2 more videos that you can look for that. But there are also other videos on my channel as well that you can continue watching, 2 of which will be appearing on your screen right now. So just pick one and enjoy it. And I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.